Gary Lachman is a prolific author of many books on esoteric philosophy, metaphysics, consciousness, and so much more, including Madame Blavatsky, the Mother of Modern Spirituality, The Secret Teachers of the Western World, The Lost Knowledge of the Imagination, and tonight we enter part 2 of a 3-part series of talks based on the book, A Secret History of Consciousness. You might remember Gary as Gary Valentine, the velvety and unmistakable bass player of the legendary rock group Blondie. And before moving to London in 1996 and becoming a full-time writer, Gary studied philosophy, managed a metaphysical bookshop, taught English literature, and was a science writer for UCLA. He's an adjunct professor of transformative studies at the California Institute of Integral Studies, and we are grateful to have him with us tonight for part 2 of a 3-part series. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Gary Lachman for Esoteric Evolution. Take it away, Gary.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you all for attending the talk this evening. And last time we talked about cosmic consciousness. And we're kind of going to take it from there. And I think we're going to emphasize, well, both sides, we're going to emphasize the cosmic and the consciousness side. And I'm going to be talking about 2 figures, one of whom I suspect many of you should be familiar with, Madame Blavatsky, and Rudolf Steiner, who came after her, who you might know was a major figure in the Theosophical Society some years after Madame Blavatsky, in the early 20th century, when Annie Besant was the head of it. And we're going to what I'm going to talk about is how Blavatsky actually is the one who sort of gets the ball rolling with the notion of consciousness as something that evolves, we can say. And what Steiner does is he takes that idea and a good deal of her system and adds to it quite a bit. Steiner he comes from a basically Christian sort of mystical background, but we're not going to look at that side of it, but it's going to be the side of sort of German romanticism or German idealistic philosophy, or not philosophy so much as sort of the poetic kind of side of it through Goethe, the great German poet Goethe. So let's see, where are we? Oh, are we at the next slide here? Okay, here. So I don't know if you know the phrase, or there was it was a very well-written book. It's rather critical, but in a good-natured way, of Madame Blavatsky and other gurus in her time and in the early 20th century, a book by a fellow named Peter Washington called Madame Blavatsky's Baboon. And this isn't the actual baboon, but this is the closest picture I could get. What Madame Blavatsky's baboon was a stuffed baboon that she had in the flat that she shared with Colonel Olcott in New York, in a place that was known, it was called the Lamasery. And it's still there. It's in Hell's Kitchen in New York. I think it's 47th Street and like 10th Avenue or something like that. So, I mean, way back when, it was a reason it was called Hell's Kitchen, but it's you know, like every place else in New York, it's completely gentrified, and you throw a rock in any direction, you'll, you know, hit somebody who makes, you know, 6 figures every year. But back in her day, it was a notorious area. And it was called the Lamasery, this flat she had, because she had decorated it in this incredible oriental and exotic kind of way. And they had a variety of other kind of animals and snakes and birds and things of that sort. But the stuffed baboon, and he was known as Professor Fisk, and he had a copy, I believe it was sort of like a sheaf of notes, like he was about to go give a lecture. And this was supposed to be a satire joke on Darwin, or actually not so much Darwin himself, who was here, but his T.H. Huxley, who was known as Darwin's bulldog, who was fighting the battle for evolution, basically, natural selection, to be taught as scientific fact. And there was a famous debate between Huxley and Bishop Wilberforce, who was someone who was upholding the traditional, Christian view and so on, and and the whole idea that mankind had evolved from apes was just, sort of ridiculous and all that. And what Blavatsky did was that she didn't sort of disagree in essence with Darwin about evolution. She believed that things, evolution was something that happened, things changed. But what she did was she expanded the idea. She said, the area in which Darwin and Huxley and would be Herbert Spencer would be the other one who popularized the whole idea of survival of the fittest. What they were talking about is true within the boundaries which they're talking about, but it's a small segment of a larger kind of cosmic evolution that she was going to, well, what she did was she was sent into the West by her masters in Tibet to stop the tide of materialism. And it was materialism not in the sense of consumerism as we see, we call it today, but materialism in the sense that the notion that everything could be explained in terms of matter, everything could be explained in terms of little bits of matter, in motion, different combinations, and they eventually give rise to all of us. And and Darwin's idea of evolution was that the change happened over time when species turned from one to the other. There wasn't any purpose, there wasn't any intent. There wasn't an aim in view. It was a product of completely mechanical forces. The need to survive, the pressures of the environment, and random mutations that occasionally produced something that was beneficial, that would help survive, and so on and so on. And what Blavatsky did, and what she was aware of, and what someone else at the time who was eccentric in his own way, but still more or less within the mainstream, was also aware of, Samuel Butler, who's more known, most known for writing Erewhon, and then his also novel The Way of All Flesh. But he thought there was just something wrong with Darwin's idea of evolution happening just purely by chance. And as you may know, Alfred Wallace, who basically co-discovered the idea of evolution, natural selection, he discovered at the same time as Darwin did, but he very graciously allowed Darwin to take the sort of credit for it. He too thought there was something missing from it, and Wallace was someone who was very interested in spiritualism, and he was a member of the Society for Psychic Research and things of that sort. So he's very often very gently airbrushed out of the story. But what they both believed had happened, and this is Butler's phrase, was that Darwin had taken mind out of the universe. Hitherto it was God, intelligent design. There was some intelligence at work. Because look at the wonders of nature. How just the simplest thing, the simplest blade of grass or flower is just such a complex reality that the idea that this could have happened through mindless chance operation just seemed completely unbelievable. But all the requirements for it to finally seem convincing were in place. There was Darwin's theory, there was and then he borrowed from Malthus the whole idea that there was the struggle for survival, and the notion of time. Time had extended because of the work of George Lyell, who preceded Darwin, and Lyell was the one who extended the length of time that the Earth had been in existence through his studies of geology and things of that sort. Up until then, many people agreed with the calculations of Bishop Ussher in, I think, the 16th or 17th century, when he said that creation had started in 4004 BC. So 5,000 sort of years earlier, that's when everything started. So up until this period in the 19th century, many people believe this. And the whole Darwinian kind of eruption was so remarkable, not only with the idea that we had descended from apes or some other simian kind of ancestor, is also that the world was much older than we had imagined it to be. And there were millions and millions of years in which humans didn't exist, and the strange creatures that existed in prehistory. and all that. So there was this shudder that ran through the 19th century. And if you know some poetry, if you know Dover Beach, Matthew Arnold, he talks about, ignorant armies clashing by night and all that. And then there's a poem by Tennyson called The Kraken, Release the Kraken, and it is more or less of that. But these poems they have this strange sense of futility about them. And this was the notion that there was no reason behind our existence that was taking over. And something else that was happening around that time too was the discovery of what's known as the second law of thermodynamics, entropy. And this is basically the idea that, the energy in the universe is running down, and eventually it'll all sort of even out, like your latte when it gets to room temperature. So eventually the entire universe will just be like a sort of room temperature flat latte or flat white, and it'll be this kind of amorphous cosmic soup. And this was something that science was saying, like, we don't necessarily want this to be the case, but this fact seemed to be telling us this. So this was the whole environment in which Madame Blavatsky's book Isis Unveiled exploded on the scene. And she even predated historically Samuel Butler's attempts to show that there's something wrong with Darwin's theory, in the sense that look at what it's leaving out. And what Butler did was he collected many, many, many examples in nature itself where it seemed that this could not have happened by chance. There's certain kinds of there's a wasp who stings a caterpillar in precisely the right place, and the caterpillar will be paralyzed but doesn't die, and then the wasp lays its eggs there. Then the eggs eat it's gruesome, but it's nature. And then the wasp eggs eat the caterpillar, and so on. So a variety of different examples where this kind of blind chance couldn't explain it. But Blavatsky didn't even bother to do that, although in there, it's a hodgepodge of things, so she collects quite a bit. But as I said, her idea was that the Darwinian story was just a smaller segment of a larger kind of cosmic evolution. And this is what we find when she gets around to about 10 years later doing The Secret Doctrine. And I mean, again, this is like bringing coals to Newcastle. I'm talking Theosophy to Theosophists here, so you probably know this better than I do. But again, I'm putting it in a historical context and sort of where this idea that I'm talking about a kind of evolution of consciousness, where consciousness changes over time. And this is something Blavatsky is saying, is that, well, not only is Darwin's picture a small segment of what's really happening, the real forces at work aren't matter, aren't bits of matter, atoms, which at that point, this is like pre-quantum and all that. So the atoms are like still like little tiny little billiard balls, like banging into each other. And that is making everything happen. No, that's wrong too, because consciousness isn't just something that happens to pop up in our individual, skulls here through the activity of these billiard balls bouncing around inside our skulls. It's the whole, the whole story. Everything is part of consciousness. So for Blavatsky, evolution is an evolution of consciousness from the smallest kind of bit of matter to the Godhead itself. And we are all part of this. We're part of this vast kind of movement in which everything in the entire universe that we know of, and that's only one universe of many other universes that has come and gone. And this, in a way, was a kind of, what do you want to say, a kind of answer to the notion of this heat death of the universe that scientists were all talking about in the 19th century, where she's suddenly saying, well, that's the in-breath and the out-breath of Brahma, and there's the Manvantaras and the Pralyayas, and there's the whole, inhaling and exhaling, and each of these is a universe, and so on and so on. So she's upping the game. She's taking it outside this. Yes, you're right within that, but you're not aware of this other thing. And the reason I'm introducing, as she did in the previous book, Isis Unveiled, which starts out from a Western esoteric magical, position. She's reintroducing the ancient Hermetic traditions, is that these people in the past were aware of this. And they were aware of so many of the energies that were, becoming available to science at that time. So, I mean, one of the main things in Isis Unveiled is to say that, yes, all the wonderful discoveries of science, they are wonderful, but again, they're part of a bigger picture, and the bigger picture is that the ancients knew this and more. And then in the Secret Doctrine, she spells out in quite a bit of detail this picture of this kind of vast cosmic evolution, in which everything is part of it. And so it's not just the evolution of, ape to man, and even that she said was wrong. She's saying the apes are not. We didn't come from them. They're a kind of failed offshoot of a certain, attempt at experiment towards creating humans. And again, another thing that's very, very different between her picture and in general any kind of esoteric or hermetic view of human, say, evolution against sort of the scientific one, is that it is human-centered in the sense that not, we are the most important things, but we are essential part of the mystery. We are essential part. We're not just an accidental product of a chance universe with fundamentally blind, bits of matter bouncing into each other, which is what the standard picture was. So Blavatsky ups the game. I mean, I needn't tell you about the whole story, about all the different root races and things of that sort. I mean, you're all well aware of that. And that, I mean, fundamentally that, she basically laid the groundwork for pretty much all of the esoteric philosophy to come after that. I mean, everybody more or less emerged from Theosophy. And one person in particular I'm going to be talking about who did was Rudolf Steiner. And I know he's kind of the competition. And I know even geographically, where the Theosophical Society is in London, it's the Steiner house isn't too far away and all that kind of thing. But what happens is that Steiner, he first becomes aware of Theosophy when he's still in Vienna in around 1888. And this is because he's friends with a fellow named Friedrich Eckstein, who was one of the main sort of theosophical advocates at this time, someone who was involved in a variety of different esoteric and occult sort of pursuits. And he gives Steiner a copy of Sinnott's book, Esoteric Buddhism, and because he's just come back from a visit to England. And I think it was translated in German. In any case, Steiner can't get on with it. He doesn't like it at all. And it's not to some years later when he's in Berlin at the turn of the century here, when he's become a kind of all-purpose German Herr Doctor intellectual who can lecture on anything. And he's lecturing. He's a popular lecturer. He's lecturing on a wide variety of different kinds of things, and sort of society and culture and things of that sort. And he is asked to give a lecture on Nietzsche, the philosopher Nietzsche, who has just died. He spent the last decade sadly insane. Steiner met him once, insofar as you can count meeting someone who was basically out of their mind at the time when they were introduced. And the reason Steiner met Nietzsche is that Nietzsche's sister, Elizabeth Nietzsche, had basically got control of Nietzsche's work and got control of Nietzsche. And what she wanted to do was to start a Nietzsche archive in the same way that there was a Goethe archive. I'm jumping ahead a bit, but we'll get onto that in the next slide. And Steiner was involved in that archive, the Goethe archive. I'm jumping ahead again. And Elizabeth Nietzsche wanted him to do the same thing. And so she arranged for Steiner to come. And what she used to do was she used to dress Frederick up here in a kind of toga and have him place him in front of the window, and he's kind of gazing into the distance, but he's actually quite just really out of it. He's out of his mind at this point, and had been for some time. And so Steiner tells a story of tells of his encounter with Nietzsche in his autobiography, and it's actually quite a strange sort of encounter. But in any case, he's asked to give a lecture on Nietzsche, and Nietzsche's own ideas about the Superman, the Übermensch, and all that, they tie into evolution and a similar sort of theme. And he's a hit. He's asked to lecture to the Theosophical Society on Nietzsche's philosophy, and they like him very much. He's about 40 years old. He spent the last 2 decades trying to find a place for himself in kind of the world, as it were, and he's been many different things. But this is kind of the turning point, when the beginning of his kind of career as a spiritual sort of teacher. So he first gives a lecture on Nietzsche's philosophy, and he's a big hit, and he's asked to come back and lecture on something else. And I've mentioned Goethe already. And Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, here he is. He's Germany's greatest poet. I guess it's kind of the equivalent of Shakespeare, although I think he's more interesting Shakespeare myself. He's never quite. I mean, there's translations of his work, and he's recognized and all that, but he's never quite translated into English in a way where you get his full kind of impact. I don't know. There's something about I'm going to say there's a kind of obtuseness in the German prose that Goethe falls victim to, and Steiner certainly does as well. Nietzsche was one of the few ones who didn't. Nietzsche danced. Nietzsche made the German language dance, which is something that not many can do. And he was a wonderful stylist. But what happens is that Steiner is asked to give a lecture on this story that Goethe has written. And Goethe, he written Faust, The Sorrows of Young Werther, many other poems. And as we'll see, he was more than that as well. And it's a very strange story. It's a strange kind of alchemical fairy tale that it's difficult to know or to say exactly what's going on in it. And if you're familiar at all with the Rosicrucian text, the Alchemical Wedding or the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz, it's sort of like that. It's full of all this kind of symbolism and all that. But Steiner wrote this article about it in a magazine that he was editing. And people at the Theosophical Society had read it, so they asked him to lecture on it. And he had become fascinated with Goethe's work, because, as I mentioned, he was involved in this Goethe archive in Weimar, in Germany. Weimar was sort of the cultural center in the 19th century. And what had happened is that as a young man, Steiner was asked to edit Goethe's scientific writings. And you may think, he was about 21 or something. At that age, he hadn't made a name for himself. So you might think, this would have been a remarkable opportunity for someone like Steiner, who was, a very, you can see him here as a very studious kind of character. He's sobriety incarnate. I mean, in many ways, he's the exact opposite of Madame Blavatsky. If you know Madame Blavatsky, she smoked like a chimney. She was teetotal, but she was, very, how should we say, colorful in her ways and language, and a very explosive kind of madcap kind of character. And Steiner was sobriety incarnate. I mean, the one indulgence into sort of excessiveness is these kind of floppy bow ties he used to wear. And he basically was, sort of a head doctor professor, and he could lecture on anything: science, literature, history, philosophy, even geography. And he for a long time in Berlin, he was lecturing at Workingmen's College, and this was sort of the rise of the time of popular education, when the lower classes were all this kind of popular education was being made available to him. So you have this here in London, the Workingmen's Colleges, John Ruskin and all that. So Steiner was involved in kind of equivalent of that in Germany before becoming Rudolf Steiner, the anthroposophist. And but the thing is that the reason Steiner got the job is that the literature people, well, the thing was Steiner was asked to edit Goethe's scientific writings, not his poetry, not his drama, the scientific writings. And the literature people thought the scientific writings were absolute rubbish. They were just dry and boring, and and the scientists thought it was just mad stuff. Goethe, he doesn't know what he's talking about. He's a poet. What does he know about science? So nobody really wanted the job, but Steiner took to it, and Goethe actually was, as we say, he was a real scientist in the sense that some of his discoveries have been incorporated into sort of the body of scientific knowledge. The one that is indubitable is his discovery of there's a bone in the human jaw that until he found it, it wasn't, no one recognized that it was there. And animals have it, mammals have it. And this was one of the arguments the old sort of anti-Darwinian contingent would use, is that, we humans, we must be something, radically different or completely special dispensation creation by God than the animals, because we don't have this bone. If we were part of this line of evolution that you're talking about. And you have to remember, the notion of evolution is that it was pre-Darwin. Goethe is a good example. He's much earlier than Darwin. The idea that over time, the species changed from one to the other had been around for a while. The reason Darwin had this impact is that, as I said, these other elements were around the same time, and he put it all together with something that really, hit as a good explanatory kind of motor of this, natural selection, the pressure of the environment, so and so. That explains it. Where earlier ones, like Goethe himself, he believed there was an evolution, but he believed there was a kind of intelligence, or a mind at work in nature. Humans, were part of nature. We weren't separate, but we were a particular kind of experiment on the part of nature, and we had a special place within it and all that. But in any case, Darwin discovered this bone. It's called the intermaxillary bone, and he discovered it in the skull of a human. So this is something that's part of the science. And the reason he discovered it was that he had developed a whole system, a methodology of observing things. He was as empirical as all the kind of, let's say, hard scientists, non-poetic scientists. Goethe was a poetic one. Empirical in the sense that it's all based on his observation. And we'll get on to one area of that I'm specifically going to talk about in the next slide. But this ranged from, talking about his contribution to evolution and human anatomy, and then there was his contribution to the study of the morphology of plants, how plants grow and the forms they take and things of that sort. And the thing that most of the scientists at the time said that Goethe is just off his rocker was when he took argument with Newton about the theory of color, the Newton's optics. Newton says, white light contains all the colors, black is no color, and it's if you take a prism and it breaks pure light up into all the other colors in the spectrum, and so on and so on. And Goethe is saying, well, actually, no, that isn't how we experience colors. See, Goethe was what we can call a phenomenologist, which is a mouthful. But basically, someone who's a phenomenologist is someone who is interested in how we actually experience things. It's, phenomena, so, tree, a cloud, sunset, you watching me, giving this talk. It's all phenomena. And ology just means the study of. So it's a study of phenomena, but not in a scientific sense, which is natural science. We don't want to take it apart and find out how it ticks. We want to understand how it actually appears in its own self. And it's a way, and this is where the poet comes in. The The poet is a natural phenomenologist because the poet is always surprised by things. The poet is always like seeing things in a way where his own, if he's a good poet, if he's not just like, you know, smearing his self over everything, which sadly a lot of poetry is about that, especially these days. But a real poet sees something, he sees it in a strange way. It's because he's seeing something without all the presuppositions and assumptions and categories that we usually put onto things just to get around. We have to do that. We have to sort of, you know, I just have to say flower rather than that particular flower out there. And if I went and looked at it, it would be unique and have its own character and so on and so on. But, you know, I can't, unless, you know what I'm saying? We have to move around things. So we limit everything to these really quick kind of symbols that allow us to get by them, you know, quickly. But the poet is someone who, those things that fit over, or definitions that fit over our experience all the time, it's ajar at some point, and he sees something in a strange way. And that's exactly what Goethe was trying to do. And he's trying to understand, well, yes, of course, if you subject light to this kind of torture, this is what he said Newton was doing. If you torture the light, you can make this happen. But that's not how we experience color in the natural world. When we experience color, we don't have to set up this strange experiment in a darkened room with just a little pinhole in it and a spectrum and all that. You know, we experience color in the sense of for him, it was a kind of, again, he spoke in anthropomorphic ways, but it was a kind of struggle between dark and light that went on. And I can't go into detail about that, but when the people read this, said, whoa, what? I mean, Goethe, yes, Faust and all that, fantastic, can't fight you there, but what is he going on about Newton here? It's just mad stuff. So no one really wanted to pay attention to Goethe, except, you know, nutters on the fringe. And one of them was a fellow named Henri Bortoff, who he's wrote an introduction to this, but he's also written quite a few books based on Goethean science. I met him some years ago. He passed away some years back, but I met him very briefly once at the British Library. But there are people that have done work on Goethean science, and if you know about the Steiner's world and the anthroposophic world, there's a lot of that going on. Okay, so what was it that Goethe did that made it different? Why was the way he observed things different than the way Francis Bacon observed them? You know, the guy who starts the empirical or experimental school. And he too, we have to put nature on the rack. You know, we have to torture it in some way, reveal her secrets. And Goethe says, no, you don't have to torture. Nature will reveal her secrets. Nature's revealing her secrets all the time. And Goethe said, nature has neither kernel nor shell. Okay, so think of that. Neither kernel, which is inside the shell, nor shell. There's no inside, there's no outside. It's there kind of all the time. It's available. Nature doesn't hide, but we have to learn how to see in the right way. And this was something that Goethe, he called it different things, but it is basically something he called sort of active seeing. You know, we tend to think we open our eyes, we look, and stuff's just there, and our minds are just mirrors reflecting what's outside. And Goethe is saying, well, actually, it's not quite like that. We have a kind of active relationship with the world out there. I mean, he'll later say that truth is at this meeting point between what he calls the unknown law in the outer world and the unknown law in the inner world. And they come together in a way that we can only allude to. We can't, there's no formula for it. You know, Goethe spent a long time, you know, trying to describe and trying to get across. And many times in his notes, he says it's impossible. It's just something you have to experience. And once you do, you'll understand what I'm talking about. But it's a way in which the inner and the outer participate. They work together. They're not, as in the modern world we've come to understand. It's like, you know, nature's out there. As I said, this little pool of consciousness inside me, and I somehow get a picture of nature, and that's my subjective experience. But that's only in there, and all that's only out there. And never the twain shall meet, although obviously they do. We've been trying to figure out how that happens for the longest time. But Goethe is saying, well, it isn't this separate kind of thing, and then we're you know, baffled how they meet. There's a kind of continuum. There's a certain kind of relationship, a rapport that one can get into. And that's when you don't have to put nature on the rack. Nature will just reveal what happens. And when it comes to the plants, this is what he discovers when he's in Palermo, and he's at the botanical gardens in Palermo on his wonderful Italian journey. All the good Germans went south. They all went down to the land with the citron blooms, and the bad Germans stayed up in the dark forest, all the Teutonic Wagnerians and all that, you know. So, before we get on to this, Goethe has he's a scientist. He's really interested. He wants to understand, how does nature work? How do plants grow? And what's the process involved? And what's the force that's driving them? And all that sort of thing. And an experience he had some years earlier when he was a younger man and he was studying in Strasbourg, relates to what he discovered later on when he was in Palermo. And when he was in Strasbourg, this is the Strasbourg Cathedral. And at the time, Goethe was there, it was the tallest structure in Europe. And it was a wonder, and so on and so on. And Goethe spent a lot of time studying it. And, you know, again, he's somebody who had this fantastic, remarkable, wide range of interests. And he you know, studied many things. And he wanted to really understand the architectural ideas behind the cathedral. And he was, the story is that he was at a pub or, you know, a tavern, you know, that evening and talking to some people. And they were talking about the cathedral. And at one point, Goethe said, it seems to me that, you know, at one point, the architect or whoever was building it suddenly made it a different idea. They changed the idea and they did something else. And someone there said, well, that's interesting you say that, because that's true, but it's not that well known. It's not something that was, you know, made public. And how did you know this? And Goethe said, well, the building itself told me, the cathedral itself told me. I spent so much time looking at it and gazing at it from a variety of angles and different lights and different, you know, perspectives. And I could see this kind of organic necessity in, you know, its structure up to a certain point where something changed. And this was something that Goethe put to use, this kind of way of getting into a rapport with what he was observing, that it would talk to him, it would show him. And this is what phenomenology, again, it's a mouthful, that's what it's about. It's letting the things appear. It's trying to take yourself out of it in one sense, all of your assumptions about something, but at the same time, you're putting more of yourself into it in the sense of a kind of active participation in what you're looking at. You know, it's not a cold, detached, which is the cliched, you know, notion of the scientist. It's a kind of rapport is the best word I can come with at the moment. And Goethe was very interested in, he believed in something he called the Urpflanze, which is a great German word, but it means the primal plant. And we can think of it as the archetypal plant. And that's it's a notion of there's a kind of, and again, it isn't like he's not talking about some one plant that you know, grew somewhere in the world and all of the plants came from it. It's like that, but not on a physical, organic level. It's the idea of the plant. Goethe is one of these who, well, Blavatsky in her own way talked about this, where, you know, the physical world is a kind of symbol of a higher overarching, you know, a meaningful sort of world. And it reflects that world. So the variety of incredible, you know, complex forms and structures that we find in nature are reflections of these eternal kind of forms, Plato's forms, or Jung talks about archetypes and so on and so on. And Goethe, he wanted to actually perceive this Urpflanze. And he thought on his Italian journey, when he's you know, not in Weimar anymore, and he's not in you know, in places where the plants that he wants to study grow naturally, you have to go to a hothouse, that he could see them in a kind of natural setting. I know there's a hothouse here, but I'd like that photo. And he talks about how he was on his way to go finish his poem he was working on, but instead of doing that, he took the visit to the botanical gardens in Palermo. And it was there that he said that he discovered the Urpflanze. And he sat and he observed, one of the plants there with the same kind of, rapport and sympathy that he had with the looking at the cathedral in Strasbourg. And he said eventually it came to him, and he did a series of drawings about this. And I'll just go back to a second about, and so in this book here, it comes out many, many editions, and I think there's even a PDF online. This is where he's talking about, how he takes you through the whole series of metamorphoses of the plant, where it starts from seed to, sprout and so on and so on and all that. And this is what came to him through this deep meditation on the plant there. All right, so what has this got to do with Steiner? Well, so Steiner takes this very, very seriously. No one else did at the time, and certainly nobody was particularly interested in Goethe. They had to explain it like, gee, he's brilliant, but he wrote all this wacky stuff about science. It's, I mean, you find that in a lot of critical studies, like the great English poet Yeats, who we know was interested in magic, and he was in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and all that sort of thing. He was a theosophist. He met Madame Blavatsky when she lived here in London, and they have to, but we have to put that aside because he's a Nobel Prize-winning poet, and we can't talk about that magic stuff seriously. But that's there, and it's fundamental. It's not something that's just tacked on in a kind of eccentric interest. It's something that's fundamental to their view. So Steiner took Goethe's notion of this active seeing in the Urpflanze very seriously, and one reason he did was that in his own life, he like Madame Blavatsky, he had certain kind of psychic experiences. He tells a story when he was a young man. His father worked for the Austrian railway, and he was at the the station one day by himself, and he says this woman appeared, and she looked very distraught, and she walked up to him and said, help me now and in later life. And then she walked into the stove, old kind of old-fashioned iron stove heating the place, and then she disappeared, he said. And he later discovered that she was a relative who had committed suicide. And so a variety of other psychic experiences like that happened to Steiner at an early age. And then he talks about being able to see the nature spirits and that kind of thing, walking through the forests in Austria and so on. And so he understands what Goethe is talking about, and he understands it as a real, as we say, epistemological theory. Well, it's a theory of epistemology. It's a theory of how we know things. But it's also something that's a reality about human consciousness. And what this adds up to for Steiner is what he says: the world isn't there just for us to look at and gaze at, again, which is the modern notion, the Cartesian notion that consciousness is just the mirror of what's out there. It actually is involved in actively bringing the world into being in some way. And this leads him to his whole notion of what he calls supersensible perception. And that would be what Goethe was doing when he saw the Urpflanze. The Urpflanze isn't a plant you could, dig up and go and plant, in your own garden. You could look at any plant and you could see the Urpflanze from it if you was able to develop this kind of rapport that came to Goethe. Well, he said he was a poet, so he came to him, he sort of had a natural propensity for it. I mean, in English, Blake is sort of doing the same thing, although he wasn't a scientist in the way that Goethe was, but he's talking about how nature is the vegetable glass that reflects, the realities of eternity and all that. But Steiner, he's Germanic, he's professorial, he develops a whole methodological approach to being able to develop what he calls supersensible perception, being able to see, not with the senses, but with the mind or a heightened consciousness, the realities that are there for us now, but they're obscured because our mind and consciousness is focused primarily on the material sorts of things. And this, so he takes Goethe's idea, but he runs with it as it were, because he's not interested only in seeing the Urpflanze. He starts talking about the whole cosmic history of humanity and the universe, as Blavatsky did. And after his success lecturing to the Theosophical Society, he joins the Theosophical Society, becomes head of the German branch of the Theosophical Society. He rivals Annie Besant, as being, as important and prestigious and significant within the Theosophical Society for this time. And this eventually leads to a split when Annie Besant and Leadbeater promote Krishnamurti as the avatar of the age, and Steiner can't accept that, and he leaves, and this is when he starts his own movement, what he calls Anthroposophy. So Theosophy is the wisdom of the gods, or God wisdom. Anthro is man, or human. So it's that's a subtle shift. He's bringing in this, Goethe's ideas. I said there's a Christian element which we didn't talk about, but the supersensible perception is what allows Steiner to read the Akashic record in the way that Blavatsky did, and Besant and Leadbeater and others have. But his story is very much along the same lines. It uses the very similar kinds of what do you want to say? He's talking about Hyperborea and things of that sort, and Atlantis and all that too. But he twists it a bit differently. And I mean, these are two books. This is one book if you're interested in Steiner's approach to developing your supersensible perception. You can do that. One of the exercises he uses in knowledge of the higher world's attainment is to follow a plant through all of its stages of development. So from a seed to sapling, and all that, fruit to flower, and so on. And if you can follow that in your mind and then sort of reimagine that process, what's happening is that you'll be able to observe the plant in its kind of eternal form. And what we see is the growth of it as its process in time. But that's something that in a way is a reflection, as we said, of its eternal form. There's a variety of other things like that. And then there's a few books, and Steiner lectured forever. So there's many lectures about this kind of cosmic history. But there's a collection of articles he wrote for a magazine that he edited that is called Cosmic Memory, and this is his take on the previous root races and human evolution and so on. And there's one in particular that I talk about in Secret History of Consciousness, which is something I've talked about in other talks, other lectures. If you've been to them, you may have heard of this before. But the way Steiner describes what he actually does when he's reading the Akashic record is very much along the lines of what we know as this intermediary state between sleeping and waking. It's known as the hypnagogic state, or hypnagogia is sort of the phenomena that take place in this state, the liminal state between sleeping and waking. And this is something we all experience. We go to sleep at night, we wake up in the morning. But it's a kind of pre-dream state. It's a state in which you can watch dreams take place. You're still awake, you're conscious of yourself, you're drifting off to sleep, but as you're falling asleep, as your conscious control and your ego start to dissolve, they're not completely gone, and you can observe dreams as they start to come up. And most of us just go through that state fairly quickly and fall into the dream. But if you become aware of it, you can extend it. And many people have written about Jung, Uspensky, Swedenborg, Steiner in this context, were people who develop ways in which they could extend staying in that state. And the reason it's interesting is because it's a state that you said it's a pre-dream state, but it's a kind of state in which words give way to images and pictures and symbols and forms and things of that sort. So it's a pre-verbal kind of state. And the way Steiner describes what, in his sort of cosmic history, what he calls old moon consciousness, he has these very, very, to me, kind of unwieldy terms to use. He talks about old Saturn, old sun, old moon, and there's the earth, and then from earth we're going to move on to other Jupiter and Vulcan. There's other it's a kind of V kind of trajectory. But in the old moon epoch of consciousness, which precedes our waking state in the earth, consciousness was in a kind of dreamlike sort of state, in which it wasn't verbal. It wasn't based on words. It was based on images and symbols and so on. And other people have come to similar conclusions about kind of earlier form of human consciousness, independently of Steiner, although this fellow here, Owen Barfield, who I talk about in my book, Lost Knowledge of the Imagination, he became the follower of Steiner in sort of the mid-1920s. But prior to that, he wrote a book called History in English Words. And he became fascinated with the history of language because it struck him that the history of language revealed a kind of archaeology of consciousness. And you could see changes in consciousness through looking at how language developed over time. And he's talking about English in this one, but he also was looking at ancient languages as well. And the fundamental thing that he discovered was that as the further back you go in the history of language, the language becomes more and more figurative. It's more metaphoric. It's more pictorial. It's what we would call poetic language. It has, what Barfield discovered was when he read or translated ancient texts, it had the similar effect that reading the poetry that he loved had on him, because it's somehow the language is more alive. And this was something that completely different, having no contact whatsoever with any of this. A fellow named Erich Heller, who was a German scholar, who he escaped from the Nazis, lived in England for many years. And he's a brilliant writer on sort of German literature and German thought. But he too, in a book called In the Age of Prose, argues that the kind of prosaic, matter-of-fact language we have today is not how language started out. Language started out in a much more poetic, metaphoric, figurative, pictorial kind of form. And over time, it became this dry kind of matter-of-fact, factual, prosaic, what we call prose. He says the age of prose. And so, in a way, these confirm what Steiner is saying. They don't necessarily confirm the overarching picture of Steiner's kind of vision of things, but just in the general sense that Steiner is saying that an earlier form of consciousness was something that was more pictorial and figurative and metaphoric. And what I say in book Secret History of Consciousness, but also in Lost Knowledge of the Imagination and in other books, is that we can see this movement from a kind of more poetic to a more prosaic way of seeing things, a way of speaking about things, as a shift from a more right brain to a left brain kind of perception. And this is something that has come out in other, Ian McGilchrist most recently has talked about this in great detail. Other books that deal with this as well. Very, very interesting book called The Alphabet versus the Goddess, a fellow named Leonard Schlein. It came out some years ago. It's a very, very good read. And fundamentally what he's saying is that the development of literacy, of reading, sequential, left to right, and all of that sort of spelled the end of an earlier, more pictorial, figurative, metaphoric, image-based, and he relates it to what he suggests as a matriarchal kind of based society. So there's a kind of struggle there, just as there's a struggle here. The master and the emissary. It's the master is the right brain, the emissary is the left brain, but the left brain is kind of got above itself and decided that it's the boss, and so on. And similarly here. And another book that predates both of those, a book by Colin Wilson called Frankenstein's Castle, where he too looks at the time were relatively new discoveries about the relationship between the hemispheres. But what he points to, and what they all point to as well, is that when the two of them work together, we get something that's radically different than either the prosaic left brain, just the facts, ma'am, kind of consciousness, or the more immersive, participatory sort of right brain one, which we actually, we like that, it's very enjoyable. That's why, we enjoy, drinking alcohol or taking other substances or achieving these states through meditation, things of that sort, because it's a release from the kind of, how should we say it, the kind of burden of a kind of left brain consciousness. But evolution itself seems to be suggesting like, well, we moved out of that. So the idea isn't to return to something. It's the idea to kind of bring them both together. And this is what Steiner was talking about too, when he's saying in the next sort of stage of human evolution, or evolution of consciousness, it will be a recapitulation of this earlier kind of image-based consciousness without giving up our, rational waking consciousness. So it's what I call the Goldilocks effect, getting it just right. So it's not it's not too left, it's not too right, it's just right. And we know this intuitively. I mean, one of the most ancient symbols, the symbol of the yin yang, is a kind of intuitive recognition of the need to bring the two together, not in some kind of bland uniformity. I mean, they're different and they each have a tiny bit in the other, but it's a kind of constant kind of polar relationship, which in this wonderful painting by William Blake, he shows in his own kind of Christian iconography. And I don't believe Blake was aware of the yin yang symbol. He was aware of some Eastern teachings and all that. You have to remember, this is late 1700s, early 1800s. I don't think he was aware of the yin yang, but he captured it intuitively there. This is Michael binding Satan. And it's it's kind of light and dark, in a kind of relation, and you could even see here. I mean, the dark here looks kind of frightened, and he's not necessarily aggressive towards it. In a way, it's kind of like it'll be all right. I'm in control now, kind of thing. So I'll leave it at that. And so what I was trying to say this evening is that. We have this notion of, yes, consciousness evolves as part of a larger kind of cosmic kind of evolution. And we could say that we have some evidence, even in our own experience, of a kind of earlier state of consciousness that we associate with dreaming, that when we become, well, in these hypnagogic states, in between states, we become aware of the two at the same time. I would say that we're feeling the beginning of what might be the next step. So thank you very much. And I appreciate you all being here this evening.